Yeah, thank you, Maxine. Thanks everyone for joining this morning. So we're going to talk about environmental sustainability and how to get started, particularly as a smaller business. Some of the business case for doing that, but also briefly trying to get into some of the science to give you the understanding of the reason for urgency and action, as well as what it will mean to you as a business. And the goal for me is that you all go away with a really clear understanding of at least the scale of the challenge, the urgency, what you can do next, where there are sources of help, to be able to have a real impact. And it's, as I often say to people, it's not about doing lots of stuff necessarily, or lots of expensive stuff. It's about understanding where you have the biggest impacts and where you can most impactfully spend your precious time and resources, and crucially to prevent greenwashing, which is something we all too frequently see. Next slide. Perfect. So this is what we're going to talk about today. So this was in the briefing notes that went through. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but I want it to be interactive. So if you have questions as we go through, then pop them into the chat screen at the bottom, or pop your hand up, and Maxine will keep an eye on that and interrupt me as we go through. There will be time as well at the end for questions, so a really good chance to ask those, potentially stupid questions that people are always scared to ask. Nothing is off limits, so fire away. And in a moment, I'll ask you all to perhaps just very quickly say, who you are, where you're from, and if there's anything particular you'd like to get out of the call today, and then I can try and make sure we cover that as we go through. So firstly, oh, hang on. Sorry, having problems getting slides to move. There we go. So quickly, a bit about Consciam and who we are. So Consciam is an environmental consultancy, a purpose-led consultancy, and we exist to make a difference. That's fundamentally why I set the business up 5 years ago. So my background was in environmental sustainability for a global company, Capgemini, and I was responsible for the environmental well-being, if you like, for about 10,000 people in the UK and a number of sites. So having got that experience, I wanted to come and try and help particularly smaller businesses to accelerate, where they don't have a big budget, where they don't have a big team. So how can we really move forward into purposeful impact? And it's a complicated challenge. I recognise that there are not always simple answers to sustainability questions, particularly on the environmental side. So our job is to help cut through that and make it easier for businesses to understand what they can do and to be more conscious, which is where we derived our name from some slightly dodgy Latin. I work with a really broad range of clients on a broad range of projects. So everything from a national house builder, where we're doing some quite high-end work in terms of really revisiting their strategy and in terms of what that means for how you build better homes going forwards that meet the needs of people and the planet, through to working with smaller businesses, really helping them at the start of their sustainability to understand what it means to them, what it could mean, or a company like Oven Loving, for example, who are a Bucks Business First member. So Oven Loving, they make cleaning products, but they've really come from a purpose and a passion-led position where they want to change the industry. So Tina, who runs Oven Loving, has started from a point of working really closely with a potential supplier and understanding that they can meet her needs. But everything from the packaging to how products ultimately get reused and disposed of, she's thinking about. So I've been helping her summarize some of that and articulate it in different ways to take her passion and compress that into something she can share with clients and other suppliers. So broad range of services we offer, from carbon accounting, so calculating your carbon footprint so you can measure and move forward from there, to policies, to strategies, looking at environmental compliance. So there's a lot of legislation and voluntary things to comply with, and I can help organisations do that. And like I say, purpose is really important to me. So and I think more and more to small businesses, many of us have set up our businesses because we're very passionate about what we do. So for me, purpose is about helping companies like yours to understand how to make a difference, but also giving back. So I quite regularly do public speaking on the environment within my community, talking to different groups. and also make a real point of kind of founding principle for me to give a proportion of my turnover away every year to environmental causes. So that's normally between 1% and 2%, with a goal to build that up to 3, 4, 5% perhaps as I grow. So perhaps enough about me. So keen to know, like I say, just very quickly, bit about your businesses and perhaps either your aspirations or the key question that you're holding around environmental sustainability. So Maxine, perhaps can you unmute people in calls?
Yeah, sure. Susan, if we start with you, if you can unmute yourself, lovely. I noticed you did put a chat on saying about you're halfway writing a blog on greenwashing. So yeah, if you could just give us a bit of background about, you know, yourself, your business, and what you're doing, please.
Phil, I think we met possibly at the BBF AGM
Yes.
Last year. So yeah, my name's Susan Staff. I'm the commercial manager of Aylesbury Granulation Services. So we're a company that takes in end-of-life plastic products and recycles them. So, you know, we pretty much do what we need to be doing in terms of sustainability, but we help other people to do that also. You know, I'm on the webinar because it's something that I'm very passionate about, just seeing what Phil has to say. Obviously, if there's anything that I can do to help anybody as well. In all honesty, we deal with large tonnages, so, you know, a minimum of 1 tonne and easily up to sort of 10 tonnes of single polymer segregated plastic. But yeah, that's what we do.
Great, thanks, Susan. I'm just going to mute you again if that's okay. Jenny, could you unmute and tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. I work at Buckinghamshire University in the duty management team and facilities. So I'm kind of partially here on that, but I also have a lot of interest in the community groups locally, and I am also involved in scouting. So it's kind of multi-purpose for me, looking at different aspects of environmental sustainability across all those groups, and how I can kind of help to push forward an agenda and change at work where possible. It's something I'm quite passionate about.
Brilliant stuff. Okay, thanks, Jenny. Mary, could you unmute and tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Hi,
I mentioned the fact that I'm doing some painting, etc. One of the reasons I haven't got my picture showing is because I am in such a dreadful state at the moment. And I have somebody in the background doing a little bit of plastering on walls, so apologies for any background noise. But I have a little gift shop in Buckingham, Finca-Monte, and as I mentioned when we started up, there's a lot of eco-friendly environmental products. A lot of ethical sourcing is the basis of all the stuff we do. But really on this webinar, because it's one of my passions as well, to be interested in what I can do, and interested in what you said, Phil, of helping people understand what they can actually achieve in the grand scheme of things. Because being a very small shop, sometimes you think, well, is my contribution going to make any difference whatsoever? So any hints and tips on how to spread the word on environmental sustainability issues?
Great, thanks, Mary. I'll just pop you back on mute, or she's done it herself. And Carolyn, if you could unmute, please, and tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, hi, good morning. I don't know whether you can see me or not. I'm not very good at Zoom.
No, we can't.
I can't find the...
should be.
Oh, there it is. Beg your pardon.
There you go.
There you go. Does that help?
There you are. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. So I am a director of Ledgers Accountancy Services. We're based in Flackwell Heath. I've been working with Phil since he set up Consciam, however many years ago that was now. I can't actually remember.
Wow.
Oh gosh, okay. And we also work with Kraken, whose logo you can see on Phil's slide there as well, who are an adventure yachting holiday company. So Phil and I are sort of doing a little bit of work together on providing carbon accounting services for clients, and we're going to start with actually doing that for Ledgers first of all, to see what we can do. what our impact is, and then see if we can roll out a model to help clients. So I'm kind of interested to sort of sit and see what Phil's got to say today, and then we'll be moving on to do some work together that's slightly different to the usual accounting that I normally do. So, you know, it's hopefully another line of business, and hopefully beneficial to existing and hopefully new clients as well.
Right, thank you, Carolyn.
Okay.
Brilliant, thank you, and that's really helpful. So that's it's useful context for me, and it's obviously great to get people sort of engaged as well. So do keep firing through questions or anything else as you want to come through. I mean, perhaps quickly in there, I mean, Carolyn, I mean, clearly I will recommend my accountant. So if any of you on the call are interested in more accounting services, then do have a chat with Carolyn. But I think that's a good example of where things can change as well. So when we talk about impact a bit later on, a lot of the data you need to understand your environmental impacts are hidden within your finance system. It will always tell you, you know, how much you've spent on electricity and gas, if nothing else, or your business mileage. So, you know, that's a really interesting way for us to try and work together to try and very quickly and in a cost-effective way help people to understand what their impacts are. So we can talk about more on that separately. And yes, greenwash, we don't want greenwash from anybody. That's the worst possible scenario. So I think, Mary, I mean, to me, perhaps one of the key things for you is to make sure you can be really clear and understand the provenance of those products that you're selling with the shop, and be able to tell that story. And when I see that done successfully in a number of sort of zero waste shops, you can really feel it. You can feel the passion from people, and that level of understanding around their products, and why they would much rather you bought this product rather than that product, because they can tell the good story about the environmental sustainability or the social aspects related to that product.
That's spot on, Phil. That's one of my first questions with any supplier I get is, you know, what are your ethics in terms of production, etc., and a lot of fair trade products that are sold as well. So I know somebody has gone in and investigated that for me, if it's something that comes from abroad, of course, which most of my products do.
Good. We need more like you. All right. Well, look, let's carry on then. So I thought very quickly. So the terms environmental sustainability, CSR, CR, CR and S, they tend to be often they're bandied around, and they do mean quite subtly different things, particularly in terms of how you present it. And I see it particularly with smaller businesses as well. So smaller businesses will quite often talk about their CSR policy or their CSR program, but it may not include environment, for example. So I thought just quick kind of my take on it. So environmental sustainability tends to focus on things like the impacts that come from your offices, your energy, the waste you produce in your office, the business travel, whether that's flying or car mileage or whatever it might be using public transport. The kind of the natural resources type aspects that have an impact on the environment, or crucially, as I think I mentioned earlier, that dependency on the environment. You know, if you work in the food trade, then you need to be really aware of how the environment is changing agricultural patterns. You've only got to walk in the fields here in Woburn Green to see how stunted the wheat is in the fields because of the extended dry spell we've had this year. So, you know, all of these things flow through. And also 14,001, I'm not sure, 14,001 is a quality environmental management standard. It's a way of saying, you know, we run our business in a certain way and we're compliant with these standards. But like many quality standards, it can be done well and it can be done less well. And I know of a number of businesses, some big businesses, that have a 14,001 standard, which you might be asked for in a bid process. But actually, when you dig into it, actually, it doesn't really protect the environment at all. So, you know, that's what I would challenge a client there to do more. So CSR programs tend to be broader. So they will be looking at how a business perhaps looks after its employees, its local community. So that could be through diversity and inclusion programs within a business, wellbeing programs, corporate volunteering with people like the Chiltern Rangers, who I was hoping they'd be on the call today, but they've not been able to make it. Really good organisation for employee volunteering, or other aspects of corporate philanthropy. That's a easy word to write down and a harder one to say. But it's worth really understanding the fundamental bit around environmental aspects. So it's all, really encourage people to have good CSR programs, but all of those are predicated on us having a healthy environment. If we don't have clean air, clean water, comfortable ambient temperatures, then none of those other things really matter. So we really need to make sure that we look at environmental sustainability in a way that's relevant to our businesses. Oh, okay, there we go. Sorry, I'm getting finger trouble trying to move the slides forward. So as I said earlier, I want to sort of just touch quite quickly on some of the background to this, because it's very easy to think about environmental issues without really thinking about environmental issues. So we're going to touch a little bit on the science here. So we're in really unprecedented times. I mean, I did my environmental studies degree back in the late 80s. I've worked in the industry. Hi, Mary. I've worked in the industry in different shapes for nearly 20 years now, and I've given variations of this presentation many times, but every year there's another frightening moment. So, for example, yesterday I think we heard the Arctic Circle has just recorded its highest ever recorded temperatures, and every month, every year, we see another ratchet up in the environmental challenges. We've seen environmental protests grow and grow, and what's fascinated me being involved in a number of these is seeing the different sorts of people that are now out on the street campaigning about environmental issues. We're seeing younger people really taking centre stage, and epitomised clearly by Greta Thunberg and all she's done, showing leadership that our governments are generally failing to provide. And 2 years ago, the scientific community told us we had 12 years to address the key issues around the environment, or we would face runaway issues around climate change. So that was 2 years ago. Clearly, the COVID outbreak has caused some challenges that companies and governments have been very much needing to focus on. But we saw Parliament partly respond to the Extinction Rebellion protest last year or the year before by declaring a climate emergency. The government followed suit by setting in law a net zero target. So for the UK to get our emissions to net zero, which means we'll still have some emissions, but we'll probably cut them to 80 or 90% of what they were at the benchmark level, and then we'll have to do some carbon capture to manage the rest. So they've set that for 2050, but that's just too late. We need to be at that point by 2030, 2035, realistically, to avoid the worst of the problems we face. And nature is an absolute crisis. So the State of Nature report is something produced every 2 years by, I think, about 40 or 50 NGOs contributed to that in 2019. And that's telling us, looks at the UK primarily, and that shows us that 13% of wildlife within the UK and our territories is at risk of extinction. And the abundance and the number of species is falling at horrific rates, 30, 40, 50, 60% for some species. And as I mentioned earlier, that's the absolute bedrock of everything. Something like 30% of our food depends on pollinators. So if we don't have bees or butterflies going around and pollinating our crops for us, we simply won't have the food that we need. And there are some crazy stories. So in China and parts of California, there are farmers are manually pollinating plants at scale. In California, you can hire bees. So you can have a truck of bees brought into your farm. They fly around your farm for a few days, they pollinate your crops, and then they move on to another farm because the local population of bees just isn't there. And these are just crazy issues that we're driving through society. So there's a call at the moment, you might have heard this phrase, to build back better, to build back greener. So this is a response to COVID. We've got to a crisis point. How can we now use this to transition? There's an awful lot less flying going on now, which is a really important aspect of a more sustainable future. We've been forced to stop flying. So how can we now use this as a way to fly less? People will still want to fly, will still need to fly, but perhaps look at flying less. So let's quickly just go on to the next slide. I can persuade my laptop to do that. There we go. So quickly, the greenhouse effect. So this is a really natural process. If we didn't have the greenhouse effect, we wouldn't have the planet, we wouldn't be here today. So, but it's also driving climate change, or our impact on it is driving climate change. So in simple terms, we get solar radiation come in from the sun. Some of that gets absorbed by our planet. Some of it bounces back off. And the atmosphere, a nice, moderate, stable atmosphere, works as a bit of a blanket, and it traps enough carbon dioxide that that warms up and other greenhouse gases, so methane, so naturally occurring gases, and water vapor, and it traps some of that radiation, and it keeps us at the general ambient temperatures that we have all around the planet, which without those we would be a very cold planet. The problem we've got is the greenhouse gases that we're emitting through burning fossil fuels in our cars, in our factories, those sorts of things, by deforestation, by moving to intensive agriculture. We're emitting more and more of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that means that there's more gases to absorb more of that incoming solar radiation. So for me, the best analogy is to think of we're throwing another duvet over the planet every day, every year, and the planet just gets hotter and hotter and hotter. Part of the built-in problem we have is, as the planet gets hotter, areas that currently are ice are starting to melt as the temperatures warm, and that has two issues. So one, we get a lot more fresh water released from glaciers and from the poles, but crucially, white areas, so glaciers and snow-covered areas, reflect solar radiation. They bounce that back into space, so that stops it warming up the planet quite as much. You turn those into brown areas, which is happening at a frightening pace, and it absorbs even more radiation. And also, as we're melting some of those polar areas, we're releasing huge amounts of methane that are trapped in the permafrost. So even if we stopped emitting any greenhouse gases today, the planet will continue to warm for decades. And that's part of why we have such urgency to take action, because we have a certain amount of continual global warming or climate change built in that is going to be with us throughout all of our lives and probably into our children's lives, even if we stopped all emissions today, which isn't clearly going to happen. So that's the scary summary of the greenhouse effect, and this is what it means in terms of science. So the graph on the left, this is 800,000 years worth of data based on ice cores. So the scientists can drill down at the poles, they can take out a big core of ice, and within that there are pockets of trapped gas, and they can analyze that gas and see what concentrations we had of carbon dioxide over the last 800,000 years or so. And you can see that we have a whole series of natural cycles as the planet oscillates and does all sorts of things. We get variation in CO2 levels roughly between 180 and maybe 260, 280 parts per million. But what we've seen since the Industrial Revolution, so the late 1800s, and now through sort of 1950s particularly onwards, we've just seen it go completely off the scale. And what the chart on the right shows you is actual observed readings. So this is a long-term carbon dioxide monitor sat at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and it's one of the global network of monitoring stations, and they're also in the same pattern, that every year our concentration is going up and up and up, showing no sign of abating. So the last time there was this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there were dinosaurs. It was 20 degrees warmer at the poles, and clearly the planet looked very, very different and would not be one that we could survive in. So let's just go on to the next slide. Don't know if you can hear my screen beeping. It seems to occasionally beep and occasionally let me advance the slide, and I don't know why. There we go. So there's a direct link between CO2 and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and temperature. So the graph on the left here is showing what we've seen since about 1880 in terms of temperature compared to pre-industrial levels. And if you look to the right, so about 2019, I think is the last data point on this chart, we're at about 1 degree centigrade of warming above pre-industrial levels. 1 degree really doesn't sound very much. It's going to be 30 degrees out there today and we're all enjoying a bit of warmer weather. But at a global scale, it's really, really significant. So it's causing major disruption to natural processes, and it's only going to get worse. So the view from the scientific community is if we do nothing, we're already going to be looking at somewhere between 4.5 and perhaps 5 degrees of warming by the end of this century. You may have heard of the Paris Agreement, the climate accords. This was an absolute benchmark in terms of countries signing up to take action. So 195 countries around the world have pledged to take action. Sadly, most of them haven't done it. So based on their current policies, we're still going to be heading well above 3 degrees. And even if they did what they've said they'll do today, we're still going to be looking at 2.8, 2.9 degrees of warming, which is just way too much. You know, we're looking at existential threats to life on Earth. the scientific view is we need to be at more like 1.5 degrees of warming to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, and certainly no more than 2. So an awful lot of work to be done to allow us to avoid the worst of the impacts. And this
Phil, sorry, Maxine here. Just a quick question from Susan. She just said, may I ask, what did the BBC have to do with the graph on the right?
They were simply collating and presenting that information.
Okay, fine, because they get a lot of information wrong when it comes to plastics. So I just wanted to know that it's bona fide.
Oh, that's good information from good sources.
Okay, good.
Sorry, let me just go back a slide. So this is just a representation of some of the things we might see. So currently we're seeing record loss of ice at our poles, which has huge impacts for weather patterns. And as I mentioned earlier, that can also impact the way temperatures get absorbed, radiation gets absorbed, and further causing heating. We've seen sea levels around the world rise by 23 centimetres since the 1880s. Again, doesn't sound like very much, but if you live in a low-lying part of the world, sea levels being a foot higher has major implications, particularly when tropical storms come in, and those tropical storms are becoming more frequent and more intense because of climate change. And in the UK, you know, our more likely experience is going to be the weather we're seeing at the moment. You know, I can't tell you this hot spell is due to climate change, but it almost certainly is. You know, we get a lot of weather in this country, but our long-term climate patterns show we're seeing more and more extreme weather, warmer weather, colder weather, windier weather, whatever it might be, and that will have huge implications for businesses in terms of potentially being able to get employees into offices when we come out of the current restrictions, but also massive impacts on their supply chains. We've seen the devastating wildfires in different parts of the world, including in the UK and some of our heathlands here, and Cape Town almost ran out of water about a year ago. They got very, very close to not being able to supply water to a massive city because there's just been a long-term change in the weather patterns. So what does that mean for business? Well, as we've talked about here, things are changing really, really rapidly and will continue to exponentially change. And that has huge impacts for all of us in business. So whether you're a business that needs natural resources, if you're in an industry that uses a lot of plastics, you might see that the availability and cost of virgin plastics from oil-based resources will change. You might also see the opposite, and Susan might be able to have a view on this, that as more and more people suddenly want to move into recycled plastics, well, there's only so much recycled plastic out there at the moment, or it's so much quality. So there can be all sorts of implications as customer preferences in particular change. And David Attenborough did more in one episode of The Blue Planet 2 or 3 years ago to get people thinking about plastics than many of us had done in sustainability in donkey's years. And he's starting, it's interesting, some of this you can see with David Attenborough and the way he talks. For a long time he's talked about beautiful animals and the wonders of nature, and he's getting more and more strong and vehement in his language about our irresponsibility as a race and how we need to change. And people tend to listen to that, and that will affect what people buy from us as businesses. And there's a lot of studies that show employees starting to want to see that they work for a responsible business, and you know that they're not part of a damaging chain of events. And investors, so there are huge amounts of green funds appearing where investors want to put their money into either funds that are passion-led for them, that they want to invest in a business that shares their long-term view, or simply they recognize that if you're in an unsustainable business, you probably won't be operating in 5 or 10 years' time, and they'll lose their money. So lots of things to think about. And Mark Carney, who was until recently the Bank of England, issued a really stark warning that companies will just simply go bankrupt if they ignore some of the risks of climate change. So, business case for action. So some of that comes about from what we've just talked about. Fundamentally, you know, I talk to a lot of clients about this just being like any other risk or opportunity for your business. If you ignore some of these things, it can have major implications for you. If you choose to engage and embrace environmental sustainability, it's going to open up a whole new series of opportunities for you as a business. So, you know, maybe a small example is Karen and I talking about where we can start to introduce carbon accounting as part of a normal accounting service, and where that becomes a revenue generating activity for us both. but it can reduce costs. So if you reduce your, simple things like focusing on how much you spend on office energy, whether that's in a home office or a main office block, you'll save money. Why wouldn't you do that? And looking for those new opportunities as we move forward. And it's also being aware of, as I mentioned previously, about what customers want. And increasingly, if you work in a business where you're supplying bigger businesses, they're going to come into more and more scope of UK-based environmental or international legislation, and that will start to flow down to you. So, I've been working with a customer recently who they've been going quite slowly on environmental sustainability until they got disqualified from 2 bids. And the moment they got disqualified from bids because they couldn't clearly articulate their environmental program, then they decided to spend more money and start to focus on that so they could remain competitive in their market space. So big companies, so again, useful for us to know what they're doing. So in the past, lots of big companies have set fairly arbitrary targets. I'll cut my carbon footprint by 10%, but increasingly they're moving to models called science-based targets. And this is a way of saying, I will look to understand what I really need to get to in my sector. And you can build a fairly simple model that says, well, actually, rather than 10 or 15% in 10 years time, this will tell you that to hit the right trajectories to get to 1.5 degrees, you need to cut your impacts by 72% by 2030 or whatever deadline you pick. So a lot of big businesses, about 600 businesses have now signed up to science-based targets. So if you trade with any bigger businesses, expect to see more on that. The UN sustainability, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, worth having a look at, again, particularly if you trade with other business. But one of the lovely things about this is just that simple iconography you can see on screen. So beneath all of these are lots of targets, lots of very specific things largely aimed at government. But what a lot of businesses have found is this is a really simple way to talk to their customers about, this product is environmentally friendly or has really good social aspects and links to this United Nations SDG. So I'll put badge number 13 on it because it's related to climate action. So it's a way of articulating, what you're trying to do and awareness. And Net Zero Bucks, so this is a campaign that's been kicked off by Buckinghamshire Business First to help businesses in our region to understand what it means and support each other as we drive to net zero emissions. So what can you do as a smaller business? So anyone who's in business long enough will understand that everyone has to have a 4-step plan. There's always a model. It looks very different, but there'll be many variations on this. And it will really, really vary depending on your business, your ambition, your scale, your customers, but the basics are all there. So it's really important you take some time in a way that's appropriate to you and your business to understand what your impacts are. Maybe that involves some detailed measurements, some carbon footprint. Maybe it's just more simply looking at what you spend your money on as a business and doing a little bit of thinking around that as to what it means to you and what the environmental impacts of that energy spend or that car mileage might be. Thinking about those dependencies, how you could get affected by a changing environment in the coming years. And the materiality piece is really thinking about where do I focus my effort? So I did some carbon footprinting with a business that they were about 200 people across 5 offices. They were spending a lot of time and effort reducing their office energy bills, turning off their lights at night. We did a detailed carbon footprinting exercise and helped them understand that actually 80% of their carbon footprint was business travel. So they're still putting in LED lighting to reduce their impacts, but really now focusing on that business travel piece to understand how they can make a difference at that point. And your supply chain and your value chain is really important as well. So as I think as Mary had said about products, really making sure you understand and can trust what your suppliers are telling you about their products, and also being able to articulate to them perhaps through a supply chain policy or something very simple that says this is what we stand for as a business. These are our principles, and if you want to supply to us, this is what we need you to be able to demonstrate. And that can be really simple or it can be really complicated. It depends on your business and what you need it to be. So then having thought about it, which could be a 1-hour conversation with yourself or some key staff or people like me, or it might be a more detailed exercise, then you can get into what are we going to do? What do we want to achieve? And again, that will really vary depending on your business. It could be developing a detailed strategy or something more simple, some lines on your website that say, look, this is what we stand for, something in your shop that helps articulate to your customers where your passion is and why you want them to align with that and shop with you. And you may want to think about what that means for policies, environmental policies, supply chain policies, and assigning some budget as you move forward. As you move into action, again, you can start with some really quick wins, and we'll touch on those in a moment. But you probably want to think, what are the easy things I can do? What are the really simple things? But what might some of the longer term projects be that, you know, I want to be thinking about in my future years of business plan? I want to maybe be talking to someone like BBF about where I can get grant funding to support some of this work, because it might be a bit more difficult or a bit more complex, or something I'm just not quite ready for. Or you might want to look at something like offsetting. So this is a bit of a contentious beast, offsetting. Some organizations use it badly. In principle, what offsetting is doing is saying, I know my carbon footprint is X, 10 tons of carbon, 1 million tons of carbon. You can go out there, tomorrow, go on a web page, you can write a check at anywhere from £2 to £7 per ton of carbon, and you can offset, which means somebody somewhere will do something, plant some trees or invest in cook stove projects in Africa to help reduce impacts. What that doesn't really do is reduce your impacts, of course. So offsetting can be used well, and I encourage people to do it if they feel they can afford to do it, offset their carbon footprint. But the real thing you need to do is to drive down your impacts now, because that's where we make the quickest impact. But as we get into that net zero scenario we talked about, when people have done everything they can to reduce their impacts, then offsetting has an even more important place. And then talk about it, communicate, you know, whether that's just talking to customers, talking to your employees, putting something on your website, putting something up in your shop, or for other businesses producing a detailed impact report that says, you know, this is what our carbon footprint is. This is so for me, as an example, I'm trying to produce my first impact report at the moment. I do them for other people, and I haven't done one for myself. My negative impact as a carbon footprint is about 2 or 3 tons a year, depending on whether I've done any international travel for customers. My positive footprint could be anywhere between a few tens to a few hundreds or even a few thousands of tons if I've helped a big company to reduce its carbon footprint. So being able to articulate that in an impact report is really powerful. So some quick wins for smaller businesses. Again, really, really variable. By all means, jump in if there's anything you've done, but if you're not doing it already, monitor. The old adage is you manage what you measure. So monitor your energy use, whether that's doing something really simple like reading your bills every month. It's a really good exercise to get into because it helps you understand where you're spending your energy, and it's a good thing to do at home as well. If you're when my kids were younger, I used to split the difference with them. So we'd read the meters every month, and if over 3 months we'd reduced our spend on our gas and electricity because they'd been good at turning lights off and turning the meter down, I used to give them half of the savings and incentivize them to do that. But you can do that at work as well. So looking to turn off equipment that you don't need if you're within an office or within a shop. It's really easy to forget to turn everything off at night, but you can save a lot of money. And again, why wouldn't you do that? And clearly it has a big environmental benefit too if you're just using less energy. When you're replacing equipment, you know, use things as long as you can, but repair them. But when you do need to replace them, look to the opportunity to replace it with something else that is more energy efficient, or depending on what it is, perhaps it's made from recycled materials or has a greater proportion of recycled materials in it. A really quick win for anyone in their businesses or at home is to look at renewable tariffs. Where can you switch your energy supply, whether that's gas or electricity, to renewables? Like anything, there are good ones out there and there are bad ones out there. So any of the big six will offer you a renewable energy tariff, but they tend not to be as good as they say they are. They might involve nuclear energy under the banner of a green tariff, which is clearly not renewable. It might be lower carbon. So companies like Ecotricity and Good Energy offer really good 100% renewable tariffs. So do look at those. And in terms of business, in travel, for most of us, travel is a really big bit. So what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 months is just actually how relatively straightforward it is to run our businesses by traveling less, you know, using Zoom. And that's going to have huge implications for the businesses that previously had very big carbon footprints related to business travel. I know 1 or 2 businesses locally who were starting to limit the number of flights their employees were allowed to take, but they've now gone 1 step further since the COVID outbreak and said, if you want to drive to a meeting, you have to get your manager's approval, else we won't approve your expenses. So they're doing that as a way to challenge the employee to think differently and try and avoid traveling unless they need to. And some of that also comes from a risk perspective. One of those companies has done a risk assessment and has understood that one of their biggest risks is their employees driving a car, particularly if they're tired or something on business. So there are many, you know, co-benefits of thinking about sustainability. Conscious of time, so in terms of waste and materials, simply buy less stuff. That's always my golden rule, and that's challenging you if you're in a business that sells things. But as from your own operational perspective, look at where you can repair stuff, where you can buy less things in the first place, buy things that can be repaired, buy things that can be reused, or when they become perhaps no use to you as an organization, you know, rather than being disposed of, are the ways to offer them to other organizations, to sell them and give them a second life. And ensuring legal compliance is really important. This is one that smaller businesses often tend not to be good at. So there's a whole series of waste legislation that applies to me, to any small business. We shouldn't be just putting our domestic, our business waste. I work from an office at home. That shouldn't really be going into our home waste bins. Most of us will do that, but we should think about our obligations, and I'll be happy to share some links after this that you can to get some simple advice on government websites about what you need to do, or to help any of you understand obligations specifically for your business. So nearly there. We'll still have 10 minutes hopefully for questions at the end. So clearly I'm here. It is a complex issue, and I always offer people a free half-hour or so consultation if it's ever helpful for people to go into a bit more detail about what it means for their business and what are the best things they can do. And obviously, you know, as needs dictate, I can offer a full range of support to businesses around environmental or social aspects. And Maxine talked a little bit earlier about grants. So she mentioned the growth grant from Bucks Business First, which can be used for sustainability consultancy. But there's also a low carbon grant. Sorry, I can't get back to that side, but through the low carbon workspaces scheme, which is administered through Bucks Business First, that will provide grants of up to £5,000 to help you adopt energy saving measures, whether that might be through electric vehicles or other aspects of saving energy within your business. So that's well worth looking at. Free money is always good. So there we go. So there's my details. I will stop there because that gives us about 9 or 10 minutes, hopefully, for some questions. So I can see there's a couple come through there. So Susan, yeah, the landlord, that's a really challenging one. I see that quite a lot with businesses, and you know, you are tied to an extent there. Where I think you know, things you can do is be constantly having that conversation with your landlord, reminding them, talking about the benefits, helping them understand that actually in many cases a renewable tariff doesn't have to be more expensive.
Completely.
Yeah.
No, it's funny because the industrialists around the whole 8 units that were like, I don't know, £100 a month, and our usage is about £500 a month. So, you know, we are so far in advance of what everybody else uses in power, and still he won't engage with me. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, so I think that there's an element there of just continuing that conversation, you know, helping to, you know, periodically sending them stuff that said, look, it doesn't have to be more expensive. It can be cheaper. It is better, you know, whatever it is. So that
the cost doesn't matter to him because I pay for it. So it's not about cost. It's just about it's not in his remit. I've got data loggers on at the moment that Matthew's lent us. So we're just doing some analysis work at the moment.
So that'll be again able to show how much you're using, I guess. But yeah, I think with those sorts of things, I know businesses that have then started to move into, you know, as you get into lease negotiations with a business, starting to use that with a landlord as a, look, you know, this is really important to us, this suite of things. It probably wouldn't just be that, but it might be other things that a landlord might be doing for you in terms of waste management or other aspects of the fabric of the building and things you want to do, and trying to just keep that conversation going so that at a point, eventually later than we would like, that they will change their mind and do more of those things that we want to do. So does anybody else have questions? We've got 5 minutes or so.
Please feel free to unmute everyone and just...
Has that been helpful? Has that given you some kind of useful ammunition or information or inspiration for your program?
It's been interesting, Phil. I don't know if you saw me run upstairs because I wanted my son to listen to the bits that you were talking about the animals, because he's doing it at school at the moment. Okay. So I'll make him watch the recording.
Excellent. Or just give me a call and I'll have a chat with him.
Thank you.
So obviously everyone, you know, having heard what you've heard, you know, is that sort of enabling you to, or thinking about doing something different with your business?
I think it's been very interesting. There's a lot of the things you've been talking about which I already do, in terms of I'm on the right tariff. I've changed my own electricity because my landlord couldn't care less, because, as I said, it's my payment, so he lets me choose what I want to do. Although other parts of the building he does control, so that they don't have quite the same freedom. It was him that was just doing the plastering in the back, but he does come round eventually, Susan, so keep on at it. But as I said, it's a small business, and so the little bits I'm doing, it's just really knowing whether I am making a big difference. And I think the confirmation that you've given us, these are the things you should be doing, that I am, is more reassuring, so it spurs me on to do a little bit more. But I'm also quite involved with the council, and they've been doing things, both the town council and what used to be ABDC, now Buckinghamshire Council, of course, declaring things like climate emergencies and committing to doing something about it, which mainly seems to be turning vehicles into electric vehicles rather than anything else. And not a lot of what I would say the practical things that seems to be something that everybody can join into. I don't know whether you have any ideas of sort of programs and things like that I can encourage them to do from a and business point of view.
I think one of the really important things is holding them to account. So last time I looked, there was something like 300 local authorities around the UK declared climate emergencies, which is brilliant. I'm really in favour of that. I want them to declare climate emergencies because then we can hold them to account. The challenge is most of them have done it without any real sense of what that means.
Yeah,
I've been in debate with Sir Bevel Stanier, who is, I'm not quite sure what his job title is, but about DMR, dry mixed recyclables, coming out of industry, because all they've done is they've piggybacked on the back of the domestic operation, and therefore they're not recycling huge elements of industrial waste, and they just won't take it. So it's just going for incineration rather than recycling. And I even put in there, you know, the climate emergency that has been declared. Nothing. It's so very, very frustrating.
Yeah, and I think it's really challenging in a lot of organisations, particularly local government, because they can be quite, as a body, they've declared a climate emergency, but there are so many different working parts within that organisation that don't talk to each other. They sit in their silos. They've got really tight budgets. Even worse now over the last 3 or 4 months because of, you know, income has gone down to local authorities and expenditure's gone up. It's really difficult, but you know, we need to keep chipping away. So I work a lot with my parish council here, trying to encourage them to do different things and just explain why. And there's a real importance of, you know, what I see a lot actually when I talk to businesses, particularly bigger businesses. So if I sit down with 12 directors from a board of directors individually, one-on-one, they'll all tell me how important the environment is to them and how passionate it is and how they love spending time in nature with their kids or whatever it might be. You put them together as a corporate body of 12 people and suddenly they only think about profit and loss. And I think we see that within local authorities, we see that everywhere. And we've got to change that through us as organisations that are more aware, enlightened, determined. You know, we're going to work differently. We're going to change that normal, and encouraging and advocating within our supply chains, within our value chains, and showing people it can be done, and then challenging them. So why aren't you doing this? The landlord conversation, you know, we'll just keep chipping away. We'll keep chipping away, and telling your customers in your shop, Mary, about, you know, these products and the provenance and why that's good, why that's better. And you're right, every little absolutely helps. There is always the challenge of why should I be doing anything when India and China and the US and name a country are not. But the reality is a lot of those countries are starting to change. They are starting to make a difference. But also, we can't divorce from the fact that quite often it's our stuff that's being made in those countries. So, you know, one of the reasons China has a huge footprint is because they make a lot of stuff that we buy in the West. So if we change our buying patterns, those businesses will change. You know, they're much more agile than governments. So by us leading the way as businesses, by telling people what we're doing, by telling people the value it has through our impact reports, by our carbon reporting, you know, and being able to demonstrate that our business grows. I was on an investor call with a clothing company last week called Finisterre. They make clothing aimed at sea lovers, so lots of sort of outdoor wear, but with a really, really strong sustainability journey. They've seen their sales increase during the pandemic. They've moved to online shopping, and they're seeing their really loyal customers just buying more and more of their stuff. And that's a pattern we see quite a lot across the industry. Customers more and more want to buy from companies that can articulate a good environmental and social story.
I'm really sorry, I've got to leave for another meeting. Thank you very much, Phil. I found it really interesting, and actually for me, it's given me things that I can go back and question the higher ups about and check whether we actually do these things and whether we have them in place. So it's given me a good starting point, but I've got a dash. But sorry, thank you very much.
If it's helpful, give me a call. I'm happy to sort things through before you talk to the powers that be.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jenny.
So unless anyone else has got any questions, shall we leave it there? Do, like I say, my contact details are there. Do feel free to get in touch, whether that's just an informal chat about what you can do or whether you want to talk about something in more detail. But I'm always happy to talk about these things.